Welcome to Celebrating Act Two. Celebrating Act Two is the user manual for the second half of your life.
Welcome back to Celebrating Act Two with special guest John Mariani. Good morning, John.
Good morning.
John, good to see you. I was reading your a recent, not the most recent, newsletter, your Virtual Gourmet. You wrote an article about how we owe a lot of our food in America, our cuisine, I will say, to immigrant food. And I assume, well, I know for a fact, having read some of your books, that you've talked about this subject quite frequently. You wrote America's Encyclopedia, pardon me, the Encyclopedia of American Food, and you also wrote America Eats Out, which I think is a great read. Um, so I, my comment is, yes, we owe a lot to the Italians and the French for our food. Why isn't there more Irish restaurants out there?
Well, that's a good question. Um, the real point of my article was that not only have they obviously contributed a lot to our food, but they've made America the most diverse cuisine in the entire world. Chinese in China, Chinese food in China, there's Sichuan, there's Hunan, there's Cantonese food in France, there's Parisian food, and there's food of the Loire Valley, and so forth and so on. In Italy, you have all sorts of foods going all the way down to Calabria and Sicily, and Tuscan food is different from Roman food, but none has the incredible diversity that we have because of the waves of immigrants who have come here since Columbus, who started off what was called the Columbian Exchange, in which he brought, he didn't bring anything at first. He was interested in the spice route, remember, not gold, trying to find spice. And what he brought back immediately to Europe was everything from strawberries and corn to turkeys and chili peppers, chocolate, all sorts of things. And in successive voyages, he would bring back, and the English would bring back things like wheat, which was not grown, they grew corn all over the Americas. And he brought wheat and pigs and chickens and a whole lot of other things that right from the start made the immigrants who came over, the English and the Spanish and the Portuguese, they brought their own idea. One of the reasons that the Puritans almost didn't survive the first winter in Massachusetts because they planted wheat, and hey, it didn't come up because there was no wheat growing in Massachusetts. So the Indians showed them, hey, dummies, plant corn. That's what we live on here. And they did, and they survived as a result. Oh, but you were asking about Irish food. Well, the Irish were part of the first great, enormously prodigious wave after the Civil War of Europeans. Let me put the word starving Europeans in front of that. After the Civil War, America was developing the West. Our manifest destiny had gone all the way to California, and we needed people. We just did not have that many human beings to take care of this vast, vast land of ours. So it was just an open invitation for people from Europe and from Asia too, the Chinese who came to build the railroads in the West. We needed people to do all sorts of things. The Italians were stone cutters. So I live here in New York. If you go to the Bronx Zoo, if you go to the Botanical Gardens here in the Bronx, that was all built by Italians who lived in the neighborhood next door, which to this day is the Little Italy of the Bronx. So they all had their talents. Now, as for the Irish came over approximately the same time, even a little before the Italians and the Jews. And of course, that's why in New York, the Irish Tammany Hall controlled the New York political system, having taken it away from the English, which you can see in a very violent movie, Gangs of New York, that Michael Scorsese made about the Anglo gangs versus the Irish gangs. So the Irish had come from a country that was not only poor but starving. But it was 1845 that a scourge took place on the potato crops of Ireland. That was called the potato famine, the Great Famine of 1845. And you say, well, didn't they have other things to eat? The English had planted the potato, which came from America. The white potato is actually from the Americas. It was brought over and it found that it propagated extremely well in the Irish countryside. And the some Irish historians in the past used to say, "Oh, the British did that just in order to penalize us, to keep us tied to one crop." No, that was not entirely true. The reason was that they had lots of mouths to feed in Ireland, and the English controlled Ireland at that time, and they said, "Well, look, give this to the people to raise. It really, really grows well." You have to eat a lot of potatoes in order to get the niacin and all of the vitamins, because they didn't have meat and they really had fish and they had really had greens and vegetables and so forth, which to this day Irish are known as potato eaters, and cold cannon is one of their great dishes. But in 1845 the crop failed, and literally millions of Irish died from starvation. From starvation. Those lucky enough to get away, by the tens of thousands, shipped off across the Atlantic to New York, Boston, Providence, other cities in the Northeast. So many that today there are more Irish in New York than there are in Dublin. And they came to New York and they found bounty, they found markets, they could pretty much buy what they wanted, and they did not have to just eat potatoes. And their children were growing healthier and taller and stronger and living longer. But they had not, because they were immigrants who were completely tied to that one crop, with no gastronomy to speak of, no great culinary tradition to speak of, except among the wealthy who had beef and pork and everything. They didn't open the kinds of restaurants that the Italians did, the pizzerias, the trattorias, and the Jews did with their delicatessens, because they came more from a background that had a much, much richer culture, even though they were very poor and starving too. So that's why the Irish opened bars. Now, they did know pubs. There were plenty of pubs back in 1845. Back in the Irish cities, capital cities like Dublin. So that's where their expertise went, into the pubs, not into Irish restaurants per se. Although the corned beef and cabbage, which is probably the best known Irish dish in America, is unknown in Ireland, and those great buffets. But the other things, shepherd's pie and the and the platter and everything, were all part of Irish cuisine in America as it developed.
Well, John, bye bye. That's a fine, fine story, Bio. And I appreciate your perspective on the Irish condition way back then. But right now, the Irish mostly go to the pizzeria. I can tell you by personal pizzeria, Italian food.
Yeah.
Why? I think around, at least around me in Southern California, it is mostly Italian food. There are um Asian food, and variations of Asian food, Thai, etc., Chinese, Japanese sushi. Um, you know what I miss here, and it might just be my region, French food. We had when we lived in Claremont, where art is, we had, I think, two good French restaurants. Just great, great French restaurants. I don't know why there's no French food down here. You have to go down to San Diego to find a good, from where I am anyway, to find a good French food. But American food today really is, maybe I'm wrong, ethnic. That's what I think of. When we go out to eat, we think of what kind of ethnic food do you want?
Mhm. Although for some reason, and I don't understand why, the term ethnic is now held in low esteem by ethnic people. It shouldn't, because it doesn't mean anything demeaning at all, except they say, well, why isn't French food an ethnic food? Well, of course it is, but it came to mean Mexican and Chinese and Italian and Indonesian and so forth. And they just don't like to be lumped into one category rather than the other. The reason, by the way, that French food, which was very, very popular in the big cities across the United States as the the cuisine of note, the standard for great restaurants, was that the French mostly went to Canada. Let's face it, Nova Scotia, Canada. The Acadians, who were French, went to Louisiana, where their name Acadians was transmogrified into Cajuns. And you and I had in grammar school read Longfellow's Evangeline, right? This is the forest primeval, murmuring pines and the hemlocks. So aside from that, the French did not go throughout most of the United States, but in both New York, where the first French restaurants were opened in the 20th century, and before in the 19th century in the great hotels, New Orleans was the great repository of French cuisine. The first restaurant opened down there, in fact, was Antoine's, which was opened in 1840, I think, 1840. And that's still around today, serving Creole French food. By Creole, it was food that was influenced by the area people, including the Choctaw Indians and others, whereas and the Spanish, because they call it the Louisiana, New Orleans. We've flown under seven flags. The Spanish were there, the French were there, the English were there, everyone was there, the Italians were there, and this influenced Creole cuisine. Whereas Cajun food, more specifically, is backwoods Louisiana food, where you're likely to find a badger in the gumbo that you are a piece of veal.
John, a slightly different twist on this. I've been in California for about 30 years, but when I was back in the mother country, in the New York metropolitan area, the place that my wife and I would go out to that wasn't particularly a specialty place like an Italian or restaurant or what have you, would be a good Greek diner.
Hmm.
And it seems that from time to time, different ethnic groups get involved in opening up a particular kind of restaurant. They would have all manner of food, Greek, Italian, just about everything you can think of, and generally quite good. And they would bake their own pastries and cakes and things like that. Have you found, besides the Greeks in the New York area, other ethnic groups that uh, began to just be in the general food service, but thereby having an opportunity to get their particular brand, let's say a Greek souvlaki's, and if that's particularly Greek, uh, get exposed, and then getting more ethnic restaurants for their area. So were the Greeks unique in that, or just because they happened to get into the business in New York?
Not unique, but the diner is a unusual and unique situation because the Greeks in Greece, back in Greece, there's no such thing as a diner. There never was. They had cafes, they had coffee houses, they had their own restaurants called tabernas, but they didn't have diners. And what happened was that the first diner opened 150 years ago or more in Providence, Rhode Island. It used to be wheeled into town and wheeled out by a horse. And it's still there. It's not wheeled in and out by a horse. It had nothing to do with Greeks. Um, Diners, as such, started to get a uh, greasy reputation as called roadside diners. Greasy spoons. Still no Greek association. It was only when the Greeks came into New York and other Tarpon Springs and other places that they, um, having no diner experience at all, simply glommed onto it. They made it their own for no particular reason, and they called it the Olympia Diner, and they call it the Corinthian
Right.
Diner, and the Ionian Diner, and so forth, the Aegean Diner, Zeus's Diner. And what they did, like many others of the ethnic families, they became family operations. And they had, as you said, these enormous menus with franks and beans and macaroni and cheese. But they started to introduce the dolmas and the Greek grape leaves and all of the Greek foods on a separate section. And it just happened. One of the great producers, manufacturers of these beautiful streamlined diners that the Greeks ran was in fact where John and I grew up in New Rochelle, New York, and they were copied all over the country. But you won't find as many Greek diners in the Southwest or out there in California because it was more of a um, eastern seaboard phenomenon. So to the so-called chop suey parlor, there's no such thing as a chop suey parlor in China. These were adaptations for American tastes in Chinatowns, in San Francisco and Los Angeles and New York certainly, where they came up with these things called chop suey and egg foo young. So those were really adaptations of the food. There's Cuban Chinese food, which is really another adaptation. There's the teppanyaki restaurant, which they don't really have. They didn't have steakhouses in Japan until Rocky Aoki opened the first Benihana of Tokyo in New York with the teppanyaki, and they're flipping the shrimp tails and everything. It's a lot of fun. Everything catches on fire. And that is specifically an American Japanese phenomenon also. So much so that one of his relatives opened the first Benihana in Tokyo, but he called it Benihana New York. The one in New York is called Benihana Tokyo. So yeah, all of these adoptions. Mexican food in America, the menus of most Mexican restaurants, including in Florida, including even in the Southwest, were copies of Cuban menus and Spanish menus rather than Mexican food. And Mexicans, of course, loathe the whole idea of Tex-Mex food when it's very similar. It's just not as regional. So if you go to Mexico, you have Oaxacan food, Mexico City style food, and Chihuahua style food, whereas the average Tex-Mex or Mexican restaurant in the United States now, except at the higher end, are generally copies of Tex-Mex food with the enchiladas and the burritos, the chimichangas, and the Chipotle style of Southwest cooking.
And of course, then the chain restaurants came in,
Mm.
and we've got a chain for every ethnic food you can think of. It seems to me. But I really am impressed by America's adaption, adoption and adaption of all these various ethnic cuisines to the point where almost in every city in the country, you can go out and have a wide choice of cuisines to dine
Absolutely
on.
true almost everywhere. In other words, hey, where are you going to get good Mexican food in Detroit? Believe me, there are good Mexican restaurants in Detroit. Where are you going to get good Greek food in Oklahoma? Believe me, St. Louis, Colorado, Texas. I mean, all over this country. Houston, Texas, one of its largest communities are the Vietnamese, who completely took over and dominate the seafood industry in Houston. And they opened vast restaurants that serving 12, 1,300 people a day. And those are the boat people. Again, many of whom did not have any experience in the food business at all, but they had a great deal of experience in the fishing industry. So almost every ethnic group, with the exception of the Irish, for reasons that I detailed, almost every ethnic
Oh,
group.
I understand perfectly.
But they one of the easiest things to get into initially is some kind of food service. You open a grocery store, you open a pizzeria, you open a little Chinese takeout place. This is easy and very cheap to do, and you can get the whole family together in on it and and thrive. And then maybe you'll open another one a few blocks away, and then your son or daughter opens another one, and that's how it grows.
It's the story of America.
Story of America.
It's a great story.
And I think there could be from time to time. I was thinking about different subjects like the kind of. I remember when I used to travel around before things were so ubiquitous and sort of cookie cuttered in every state that you could only get a cafe au lait in Louisiana or that general area, New Orleans, and then all of a sudden you had. The Starbucks all over the country at every corner offering the same kinds of things that used to be unique. Uh,
Well, see, Starbucks, as with Macaroni Grill and all the rest,
uh,
Starbucks is very indicative of corporate America getting a hold of even an ethnic food, or in this case, coffee shop. They take something as simple as espresso or cappuccino, and they goose it up and goose it up, and then they have a blackboard menu, macchiato, and this and this and this, the super padum, bada bing, bada bing, the grande. So that's so typically American, which is what you don't find in the rest of the world until recently, because even if you go to Rome now, there's a Starbucks there. There's a McDonald's, which actually uh, started the whole slow food movement in Italy. There's a McDonald's right next to the adjacent to the Spanish Steps in Rome. So it's inescapable. KFC is all over Asia, all over Japan, and a lot of it, has to do with not the taste or the quality of the food itself. It's that just like blue jeans, it's American. It's very, very much the case. They want to, when they opened in Moscow, the first Russian McDonald's, it became the highest grossing McDonald's in the chain at that time. And there were lines out the door down the street to go to McDonald's. Why? Because the Russians didn't have their own hamburgers, which are called kotlete. They're really good. No, they went there because it was American. And it's like Coca-Cola, or specifically in Russia, Pepsi-Cola, which got the license to be the only cola drink in Russia. So you don't find much Coca-Cola over there. Whether it's Pepsi-Cola or it's Blue Jeans, as I said, look, Blue Jeans took over the entire world. It's because it's America. And it's a reverse Colombian exchange, as I said, of cultures, not just food culture, but every other form of culture, fashion and sports and everything else.
well, I think this is another reason that we can be very grateful that people like yourself are continuing to investigate those unique experiences where you can go and get very quality food that better represents an individual culture, or
Hmm.
certainly somebody has brought it to a high art as opposed to just a mass produced. Places for both of them, obviously. But John, we thank you for continuing to supply us with these amazing, thoroughly interesting anecdotes. So we don't we have a sense of where we're going to go when we have a conversation with you, but then you always bring up things that about diners that I wasn't even thinking about when I asked the question, and it was brilliant. So thank you for
But it's always delicious, John.
yes,
And
Conversations with you
it's the
are
lovely and
delicious.
yeah.
delectable too.
Yeah. Okay, so in any
Good. See
event,
you soon.
go to johnmariani.com and you can order his books, take a look at his archives, and we thank you for joining
My
us.
newest novel, Love and Pizza.
Excuse me?
I say read my newest novel, Love and Pizza, chapter by
Love
chapter.
and
By,
pizza. Yes.
And you're doing chapter by chapter, you're releasing them as you
yeah.
finish the chapters. That's fantastic. Thank you. So until the next time, thank you for joining us at Celebrating Act Two, and bon appetit.
Take care.
Bye bye.
For more on Celebrating Act Two, visit our webpage, follow us on Facebook, subscribe to us on YouTube, and tell your friends. Celebrating Act Two is the user manual for the second half of your life.